Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and I'm joined by my good friend, Dee Pierce, the
Hap-
host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. Hello, Dee. How you
Hello,
doing?
I'm doing good. Happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy you're here. So, our topics for tonight are uh, okay, the Kingdom of Judea versus the Kingdom of Israel. The first test being performed on Canada of Trump's ideas on tariffs. Then there's the question of whether the U.S. attack on Yemen, the bombing attack on Yemen, uh, is an excuse for escalating later to an attack on Iran. That's an interesting question. And then we have the topic of whether deficits are necessary for the United States, because everybody is always questioning why we should be running all these deficits. Okay, then next we have the problem of Doge's power, or the issue of Doge's power to destroy.
Mm.
And after that, we consider the events of students suing the President of the United States for his violations of free speech of people who are permanent residents here. And finally, we're going to talk again about Ponzi schemes and Ponzi schemers because Elon Musk won't shut up about Ponzi schemes with respect to Social Security.
No, he won't.
No, he won't. He probably never will, no matter what we say. But let's see if we can outlast him. Keeping on repeating, no, Social Security, not a Ponzi scheme, you asshole. So here we go.
Okay, Joe, have you shared out the show? I'm sharing right now.
Thank you for reminding me. No, I forgot to share it out. So uh, I am going to share it out
Good idea.
because you reminded me. I was about to forget. I feel lonely today because there's no Pepe article.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder what he's up to.
We're probably going to have another blizzard of articles from him
Mm-hmm.
very soon. Anyway, there we go. Hmm. So I'm going to share out the first of our articles now. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Now I can't find the bloody thing.
And I'm
Why?
going over to X.
I,
I'm over at X looking for your
okay, thank you.
to share it on X. Here you are.
There we go.
Oh,
So
okay.
the first of our pieces is called The Kingdom of Judea versus the Kingdom versus the State of Israel. Uh, that's funny. I didn't know there was a Kingdom of Judea. This is by Alistair Crook,
Okay.
17th, 2025. Alistair Crooke, the former diplomat from the United Kingdom, and a very, very educated soul he is, and a very good writer. In this photo, we see war crimes, ministers get out of Gaza, Lebanon, and then there's a repeat of this in Hebrew, I guess. And this one is called A Geopolitical Reading of Israel's Incipient Civil War. Israel is deeply fractured. The schism has become bitter and heated as both sides see themselves to be in an existential war for the future of Israel. Excuse me. The language used has become so venomous, particularly in reserved channels in Hebrew, that calls for a coup and for civil war, are far from uncommon. In Israel, it will be quite a civil war because everybody is armed. Israel is nearing the precipice, and the seemingly irreconcilable differences may soon erupt into civil unrest. As Yuri Miskav writes this week, the, quote, Israeli spring, unquote, is on its way. Should be there by now. The point here is that President Trump's utilitarian and determinedly transactional style may work effectively in the secular Western Hemisphere. Well, I don't know about that. But with Israel or Iran, Trump may find little or no traction amongst those with an alternative Weltanschauung that expresses, that's the German word for worldview, that expresses a fundamental different concept of morality, philosophy, and epistemology to the classic Western deterrence paradigm of very material carrots and sticks, quote unquote. Indeed, the very attempt to impose deterrence and to threaten, quote, all hell breaking out, unquote, if his injunctions are not followed, may produce the opposite to that
Yes.
seeks, i.e., it may trigger new conflicts and wars. An angry plurality in Israel, led for now by Netanyahu, have taken the reins of power after a long march through the institutions of Israeli society, and now have their sights focused on dismantling the, quote, deep state, unquote, within Israel. Equally, there is a furious pushback to this perceived takeover. What exacerbates the societal fracture are two things. Firstly, it is ethnocultural. Second, it is ideological. The third component is the most explosive, and that is the eschatology. I guess it's eschatology. As the last national election in Israel, the underclass, quote unquote, finally broke the glass ceiling to an election to take office. The Mizrahi, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, have been long treated as the poorer, lower order in society. The Ashkenazi, the European, largely liberal secular Jews, form much of the urban professional and until recently the security class. These are the elites whom the coalition of national, religious, and settler movement displaced at the last election. This present phase to a long struggle for power perhaps can be put at 2015 as Gadi Taub has recorded. It was then Israel's Supreme Court judges removed sovereignty itself, that is, the power of final decision over the whole realm of law and politics from the elected branches of government and transferred it to themselves. One unelected branch of government officially holds power, against which there are neither checks nor balances by any counterforce. In the optic of the right, the self-awarded power of judicial review gave to the court power, Taub writes, to prescribe the rules of the political game, and not just its concrete results. Quote, law enforcement then became the large investigative arm of the press. As was true of the Russiagate hoax, the Israeli police and state attorney were not so much collecting evidence for a criminal trial as they were producing political dirt for leaks to the press. The quote, deep state in Israel, unquote, is a consuming point of contention
Ow! Stop it.
for Netanyahu and his cabinet. In a speech at the Knesset this month, as one example, Netanyahu savaged the media, accusing news outlets of, quote, full cooperation with the deep state, unquote, and of creating, quote, scandals, unquote, and, quote, again, the cooperation between the bureaucracy and the deep state and the media didn't work in the United States and it won't work here, quote, unquote, he said. Just to be clear, at the time of the last election, the Supreme Court was composed of 15 judges, all of whom were Ashkenazi, bar one person who was a Mizrahi Jew. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to see the war of the rival blocs as some arcane dispute about the usurpation of executive power and a lost, quote, separation of state powers. This struggle is rooted rather in a profound ideological dispute about the future and character of the state of Israel. Will it be a messianic halacha state obedient to revelation? Or in essence, will there be a democratic, liberal, largely secular state? Israel is shredding itself on the blade of this debate. The cultural component is that the Mizrahim, loosely defined, and the right view the European liberal sphere as barely truly Jewish. Hence their determination that the land of Israel should be wholly immersed in the Jewishness. I guess I have to remark here that many of the Orthodox Jews in this country who are not, whose background, is Ashkenazi Judaism from Europe, but Orthodox Ashkenazi Judaism, view the state of Israel itself as an abomination, which is not authorized by God. Okay, so they don't have the opinion that the land of Israel should be wholly immersed, in Jewishness. Of course, and also there are many of Orthodox people in Israel who are to the right of the Mizrahim and who shared that particular point of view. So anyway, I find this to be very interesting. There are the people from the liberal sphere who was barely truly Jewish, and the Mizrahim who define themselves as very, very Jewish. And then there are the most Orthodox Jewish people of all who don't like the state of Israel. Anyway, it was the events of 7th October that absolutely crystallized this ideological struggle, which is the second factor largely mirroring the general schism. Israel's classical security vision, dating from the Ben-Gurion era, was configured to provide an answer to the enduring Israeli dilemma. Israel cannot impose an end to conflict on its enemies. Yet at the same time, it cannot maintain a large army in the long term. Therefore, Israel, in this optic, had to rely on a reserve army that needed adequate security warning before any war occurred. Advance intelligence warning of coming war, therefore, was a paramount requirement. And that key presumption blew apart on the 7th of October. The shock and sense of collapse arising from the 7th of October led many to think that the Hamas attack had irrevocably broken the Israeli concept of security. The policy of deterrence had failed, and the proof of that was that Hamas was not deterred. But here we approach the crux of the Israeli internal war. What was destroyed on the 7th of October was not just the old security paradigm of the Labor Party and the old security elites. It did that. But what arose from its ashes was an alternative Weltanschauung that expressed the fundamentally different concept in philosophy and epistemology to the classic deterrence paradigm. Quote, I was born in Israel. I grew up in Israel. I served in the IDF, unquote, says Alon Mizrahi. Quote, I was exposed to it. I was indoctrinated this way. And for many years of my life, I believed it. This represents a serious Jewish problem. It is not just a matter of one mode of Zionism. How can you teach your children, and this is almost universal, that everyone who is not Jewish wants to kill you? When you put yourself in this paranoia, you give yourself permission to do anything to everyone. It is not a good way to create a society. It is so dangerous, unquote. So here, in the Times of Israel, an account of a high school presentation post 7th of October on the morality of wiping out Amalek. A student raises the question, quote, why do we condemn Hamas for murdering innocent men, women, and children if we are commanded to wipe out the whole of Amalek, unquote. Quote, how can we have normality tomorrow, unquote? Alon Mizrahi asks, quote again, if this is who we are today, unquote. The national religious right is leading the charge for a radical change to the Israeli concept of security. They no longer believe in the classic Ben-Gurion paradigm of deterrence, particularly in the wake of the 7th of October. Nor does the right believe in reaching any settlement with the Palestinians, and absolutely does not want a binational state. In the concept of Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's security theory henceforth must include a continuous war against Palestinians until they are expelled or eliminated. The old liberal establishment is outraged, as one of its members, David Agman, former ADF brigadier general and former bureau chief to Netanyahu, articulated this week. Excuse me. Quote, I accuse you, Bezalel Smotrich, of destroying religious Zionism. You are leading us to a state of halacha and Haredi Zionism, not religious Zionism. Not to mention the fact that you joined the terrorist Ben Gvir, who diverts lawbreakers, hillbilly boys, to continue breaking the law, who attacks the government, the judicial system, and the police under his responsibility. Netanyahu is not the solution. Netanyahu is the problem. He is the head of the snake. The protest should act against Netanyahu and his coalition. The protest should demand the overthrow of the malicious government, unquote. Netanyahu is in one sense secular but in another he embraces the biblical mission of Greater Israel, with all its enemies annihilated. He is, if you like a label, a neo-Jabotinskyist. His father was private secretary to Jabotinsky, and in practice exists in a relationship of mutual dependency with figures like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. What do these people want? Asks Max Blumenthal. What is their ultimate goal, quote unquote? It is apocalypse, says Max, whose book, Goliath, traces the rise of Israel's eschatological right. They have an eschatology that is based on the Third Temple ideology, in which the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed and be replaced with a third temple, and traditional Jewish ritual will be practiced. I don't even think it's traditional Jewish ritual. I mean, it's Jewish ritual of 2,000 years ago. That's no longer traditional.
No, it's not. And it was something done back when there was a lot of paganism in the
Yeah,
region.
yeah, there was a lot of paganism in the region, right? And I think it included many elements of paganism too.
It did because there used to be where the Jews were when they were there, and when it goes back to the whole the metals, the whole metallogic thing with Yahweh being the god of the metal and the mines and all that, that it was the Jews' choice of their god, whatever. But that was all pagan. And then later on, it switched to
Oh,
monotheism,
okay.
mono in the one god.
I'm not aware that Yahweh was a god of metals.
Yeah, it was metallurgy, whatever you call it. It was something Hebrew University went and studied back, and they were talking about how the different gods, what they were for, and the different places where they had different gods where the mines were concerned. And when you had the volcanoes erupting, they thought it was a message from the gods.
Yes, I know about that, but I always thought of Yahweh as the sky god,
Hmm.
as opposed to the god of metals.
Right. But things evolved and changed because we talked about that on one of the shows how Zoroastrianism was the first monotheistic, and how Judaism, then later on Christianity, and the whole Zoroastrianism, it talked about taking on different forms.
Yes, that was certainly true. Okay, on. And in order to bring that about, they need a quote big war unquote.
Hmm.
Smotrich always has been frank about this. The project of ultimately removing all the Arabs from the quote land of Israel unquote
Hmm.
would require an emergency, a quote big war unquote. He has said. Big question is, do Trump and his team grasp any of this? For it has profound implications.
Right, and they're wiping out all the Christians. He has these evangelical Christian support, but when it comes to the Christians in Palestine, the Western Christians are silent. They're silent with everything that's happened
Yeah,
and
that's
has been happening for a long time.
as far as the Israelis are concerned, though, these right wing Israelis anyway, they're interested in getting rid of the Christians too, not only the Palestinians.
Right, they want to Judaize the whole area.
Right. For it has profound implications for the methodology of Trump of transactional deal making. Quote, carrots and sticks, unquote. And secular rationality will carry little weight among those whose epistemology is quite different. Those who take the idea of revelation literally as quote truth unquote, and who believe it commands complete obedience.
Mm.
Trump says he wants an end. He wants to end the conflicts in the Middle East and bring about a regional, quote, peace, unquote. His secular, transactional approach to politics, however, is wholly unsuited to resolving an eschatological conflict. His bravura style of threatening, quote, all hell will break out, unquote, if he doesn't get his way, will not work when one of the other parties actually wants Armageddon. Quote, all hell break out, unquote, quote, bring it on, might well be the response that Trump gets. Uh-oh.
It's hard. It is really hard.
It is hard and dangerous.
It is.
And this piece originally appeared in Strategic Culture Foundation. I think it's very insightful because I think the problem is that the eschatological right in Israel might well say to Trump, bring it on, quote unquote. And this is also interesting for another reason. Okay, and that is the Houthis have their own ideas when it comes to eschatology, okay, and when it comes to the sacredness of their texts. And when Trump says to them, all hell is going to break out, they might have their own version of saying, oh, yeah, bring it on. We can handle it. Because the Houthis seem ready for any conflict. Okay, at
Right.
the drop of a hat. They are extremely tough people. And that's because of their faith in Allah.
Their faith, and also from their experience, what they went through.
Yes. Which is a decade of bombing.
Yes.
From the Saudis and the West. And they have emerged from the decade of bombing stronger than before. And as the biggest group in Yemen and in control of 80% of the country. So they are stronger than they ever were. And they're willing to risk everything to stop the genocide in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump is trying to be transactional with them. And they, of course, are giving him the finger and show no signs of backing off what they're doing. And I have to again ask the question, which I frequently ask, and that is, what happens when the Harry S. Truman gets sunk? Supposedly, Trump is moving 3 aircraft carriers over there now, 2 others apart from the Harry S. Truman. Those hypersonic missiles of the Houthis, some of them can carry 500-kilogram warheads. And when warheads that big strike a warship at hypersonic speeds, it's going to be quite an explosion. I was watching something yesterday where 2 members of the Defense Department were briefing some reporters at a news conference. And they were basically making fun of the Houthis. I think they're not taking them seriously enough because there's nothing fun about the Houthis. They are absolutely fearless. So here we go. Oh, do we have any comments? Let's see. We may have a few. Oh, here's Friar Steve. All the comments appear to be from Friar. No, Steve Wolfbrand says hello. Friar Steve says hello, Doc and D. Friar Steve points out without the war, Bibi would be gone. Elections are coming to Israel. Yes, they are. And he would be gone without the war, I think. But there still might be someone else allied with the Mizrahi Jews who takes over. Friar Steve is doing his countdown to Passover. He thinks the red heifer will be slaughtered.
From what I understand, like once again, it's been canceled, but and that's what I heard.
Well, anyway,
We'll see. Because then they'll move it over till September. You know, we've been seeing this back and forth, but like we said, we'll see.
and
But this is what
Friar
I
Steve
heard.
asks, "Why do you all feast in this fairy tale story?" I'm not feasting. D. Islam still has a meteorite at the Kaaba. That is modern day skyrite worship, skyrock worship. Well, as I say, Yahweh or Allah, I think they're the same.
They are the same.
We're sky guards.
Yes, sky gods. And also, going back in time, before that, before it became monotheistic, research the story of El. El was the father of Yahweh, and Yahweh there was a bunch of kids, and he was married and everything else. I mean, this is Hebrew University did a study going way back
He
when
was
it was,
married. He was married. Yahweh was married. Who was he married to?
no, Yahweh was the son of El. El was married.
Oh,
El,
El.
El was El. There was El, his wife, and then the sons. You know, you had Yahweh was a son, and that's where Baal was a son, and at different ones. And we did a whole show on this, but anyway, you could look it up yourselves. But then, of course, it became monotheistic, and then you had Yahweh because Yahweh was the one that was assigned to the area where the Jews were at, where they were living. So it's a long story. Yeah, did a whole show. Yeah, Greg was with me, and it was just a long story.
Okay. Friar Steve says Russian imperialist sympathizers in Fox News pundit. What Fox News pundit? He says it's getting hard to watch. The Midas Touch network is becoming my preferred podcast. Yep, I guess you would gravitate towards them, especially since their attitudes with respect to Ukraine. And Friar Steve says L equals Elohim. Yes, I know. D, it has to happen Passover 2025. Friar Steve says B'nai Elohim. Yahweh is the son of Elohim. Okay, Elohim in Judaism, okay, refers to Lord. When you're thinking of God as the Lord, that's when you use that word, okay, Elohim. But yeah, when you refer to God as Yahweh, then what you say, okay, is Adonai. Two different words. Kind of interesting. So, all comments from Friar Steve so far, except for Steve Wolfman saying hello. Anyway, we will get to the next piece, which is on an entirely different subject. Specifically, it is on Canada. And it's by Mike Brock. And it's the first article of his we've begun to treat here, but I think we'll be getting to many others. He's a very good writer. And very interesting because he's a philosopher. But he struck a pretty good note on this political piece.
Okay, here we go. Canada was the first test. How the U.S. is replacing institutional alliances with executive rule. Mike Brock March 15th, 2025.
And this is from the blog
Notes from the circus.
Notes from a Circus. I believe it's on Substack.
Okay. The collapsing relationship with Canada should be alarming to Americans, not just as a diplomatic crisis, but as a profound revelation of how foreign policy functions in a post-democratic framework. What we're witnessing isn't merely tension between allies, it's the deliberate displacement of institutional relationships with the personal whims of a sovereign executive.
Yeah, I think that paragraph is so profound as to what is going
Yes.
on. Right, because Canada has been so important, okay, as our ally. I mean, the idea that this relationship would be just disturbed casually by some president is,
Ridiculous. It's absurd.
yes, it's absurd. It's absurd. Please go on.
While Canada has long been the butt of jokes to Americans, the polite neighbor to the north, the straight man in our cultural comedy, this casual dismissal has obscured a crucial truth. Canada is a critical component of the U.S. national security architecture. As a
Uh,
steadfast ally,
uh, it is.
it
He,
is.
he emphasizes critical here.
Underlining it, yes.
I mean, it is critical. It is our protector to the north
Exactly.
that we never have to worry about. I mean, what
Mhm.
the hell is going on here?
Yeah, good question. What's going on?
What the fuck is happening? Anyway,
Exactly.
anyway,
As a steadfast ally, a cultural bonded nation, and a peaceful presence along the 5,525-mile northern border, Canada provides something invaluable that no military expenditure could replace: a secure flank that allows America to project power globally without worrying about threats from the north. This partnership has been consecrated with blood. Canadian soldiers have fought and died alongside Americans in conflicts spanning a century. From the trenches of World War I to the mountains of Afghanistan. These weren't abstract commitments to vague alliances. They were concrete sacrifices made by real people with names, families, and futures they never got to experience.
that's very
On
well put.
Exactly. On
Very
September 11th, on September 2001, when America faced its darkest hour and closed its airspace, Canada opened its arms. Operation Yellow Ribbon diverted 238 aircraft to Canadian airports, where thousands of stranded Americans found refuge, shelter, and kindness from strangers who treated them not as foreigners but as neighbors in need. In Gander, Newfoundland, a town of 10,000 welcomed nearly 7,000 diverted passengers, housing them in schools, community centers, and private homes without hesitation. This wasn't diplomatic calculation, it was human decency expressed at a national scale. Canada's participation in the Afghanistan war was costly and painful, a commitment made not out of self-interest, but out of solidarity with a wounded ally. Between 2001 and 2014, 158 Canadian soldiers died in Afghanistan, a significant sacrifice for a country with a military a fraction the size of America's. The impact was so profound that Ontario renamed a section of Highway 401, quote, the Highway of Heroes, to commemorate the route taken by fallen soldiers returning home from the war, a war they joined to bring justice to the thousands of Americans killed on 9/11. Canadian Okay, my screen went down. Canadians engaged in that sacrifice as friends to Americans because that's what friends do. Now, if you want to understand the psychology of Canadians today, understand the deep betrayal they are feeling. Imagine standing by a friend through the darkest moments, only to have them turn on you arbitrarily, insulting you publicly, threatening your livelihood, and suggesting that your home should become their property. This isn't a policy disagreement, it's a betrayal of trust at the most fundamental level.
Okay, I think this article is the only one I've yet seen that have put things in this way, that have put things at the psychological level,
Right.
also at the moral level and the spiritual level,
Hmm.
in terms of how the people of two countries relate, and how one country is breaking those bonds
Hmm.
for no good reason.
The 25% tariffs imposed on Canadian imports weren't just an economic measure. They were an insult wrapped in a policy. The justification that Canada is responsible for fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration is so divorced from reality. Canada accounts for less than 1% of both, that it can only be understood as deliberate humiliation rather than genuine policy.
And why would Trump want that? Why would he want to humiliate them?
Who knows?
Because he knows they're not going to knuckle under. And he got this idea in his head that he wants Canada. He wants to conquer Canada.
It's stupid.
And mad.
It is.
And mad. And when he wants something and he wants to illegitimately take it from somebody else, he humiliates them. That's what he does.
Right. And somebody put this in his head to do this.
I don't know if anybody else put that in his head.
But he's got these foreign policy people. Somebody must have thrown it in his face about Canada.
I don't know.
And then he puts it in his own language.
I don't know. I would. I mean, I don't know if anybody else would be crazy enough to think that up.
Because here you have Canada or Mexico. It's ridiculous.
Okay, keep going.
When Trump refers to the Prime Minister of Canada as a quote governor and suggests, perhaps joking, perhaps not, that Canada should become the 51st state, he isn't engaging in hardball negotiation. He's declaring that Canada's sovereignty itself is conditional, subject to his approval, rather than international law or historical precedent. This approach has done nothing to improve the lives of Americans. It has, however, succeeded in radicalizing Canadians against America, transforming one of our most reliable allies into a nation where citizens are removing American products from store shelves, booing the American national anthem at hockey games, and finding renewed patriotic unity in opposition to the United States. This pattern is horrifying. Okay, this pattern is horrifying. Other Democratic allies who watch and wonder, if this is how America treats Canada, its closest ally, largest trading partner, and most culturally similar neighbor, what does that mean for them? But to understand what's really happening, we need to look beyond the immediate diplomatic consequences to the underlying transformation of governance itself. This isn't just bad foreign policy, it's the international manifestation of a domestic project to replace institutional governance with personal rule. The hallmark of the liberal international excuse me, international order has been its institutional nature. The idea that relationships between nations are governed by treaties, agreements, and mutual interest rather than the personal whims of leaders. This system created unprecedented stability and prosperity precisely because it was predictable, rule based, and larger than any individual. What we are witnessing now is a deliberate dismantling of this system in favor of one where international relationships are based on personal loyalty to a sovereign individual rather than the institutional commitments between nations. Just as Doge is systematically replacing career civil servants with personal loyalists domestically, our foreign policy is replacing institutional partnerships with personalized relationships of domination and submission. This explains why Trump's actions towards Canada seem so counterproductive from a traditional foreign policy perspective. If the goal were advancing American interest as traditionally understood, alienating our closest ally would be obviously self-defeating. But if the goal is replacing institutional relationships with personal ones, then forcing Canada into a position of supplication becomes the point. The same pattern has played out with NATO, where the emphasis on, quote, paying bills transforms a mutual defense alliance into a protection racket. It's visible in our approach to Ukraine, where support for a sovereign nation's defense becomes conditional on personal deference rather than strategic interest. It manifests in our withdrawal from international agreements and organizations, replacing the predictability of treaties with the variability of personal preferences. This transformation isn't accidental. It's the international application of Curtis Yarvin's neo-reactionary vision, where governance isn't about institutions but about direct personal control. In this framework, there are no allies, only vassals.
We should point out at this point, okay, who Curtis Yarvin is. Uh, he is the California philosopher who has become something of a demigod for the billionaire class coming out of Silicon Valley. Okay, they've all read him, they've all taken him very seriously, and they all have bought into this a very egoistic philosophy of personal control of billionaires over everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's who this guy is. Please go on, Dee.
There are no partnerships, only hierarchies of submission. There are no treaties, only temporary arrangements subject to sovereign whim. Sounds like going back to kings and queens and the royal families, this royal family, that royal family.
Yes, exactly. There's a philosophy of techno-feudalism here.
Mm-hmm. What makes Canada's case particularly revealing is how unnecessary it is from any traditional strategic perspective. There is no rational American interest served by antagonizing Canada. There is no policy goal achieved by threatening its sovereignty. There is no security concern addressed by imposing arbitrary tariffs. The only purpose served in the demonstration of sovereign power itself, showing that even our closest relationships can be disrupted at will, that no institutional commitment is binding, that personal loyalty trumps mutual interest. It's governance as performance art, with Canada serving as unwilling canvas.
Okay, so here, okay, I want to point out that this sort of orientation that Trump has, okay, with respect to Canada, uh, okay, is not like the transactional philosophy that he seems to have in trying to deal with Israel, okay, and its enemies. It doesn't seem transactional, okay, at all. It seems like he's antagonizing Canada for the sake of antagonizing Canada.
Mm-hmm.
He's doing something uh, uh, that's ideological, having to do with his own personal ideology of hierarchy, with himself at the top of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Please go on.
The unified Canadian response, where approval for the Liberal Party has surged from the brink of electoral defeat to near parity with the Conservatives in a matter of weeks, suggests they understand instinctively what's at stake. Across political lines, Canadians recognize that this isn't about policy disagreements, but about whether national sovereignty itself remains meaningful in the face of arbitrary power. 2 plus 2 equals 4. There are 24 hours in a day, and when America treats its closest ally as a potential possession rather than a sovereign partner, it's not just breaking diplomatic norms, it's replacing the entire foundation of international relations with something fundamentally different and profoundly dangerous. For Americans watching this unfold, the question isn't whether we should support this policy or that one. The question is whether we still believe in a world where relationships between nations are governed by something more enduring than the momentary pulses of a singular individual, whether we still believe in the possibility of friendship rather than mere domination in our international affairs. Because that's the choice we face, not between tough or gentle diplomacy, but between an international order based on mutual respect and one based on submission to the sovereign. Canada is just the first test case in this transformation. It won't be the last. That was a
Yes,
really good article.
it was a really good article.
A lot
Terrific.
of good points.
Yes, it gives us a new way of looking at what Trump is doing.
Yes.
Uh, it's certainly uh, it certainly looks like very dangerous stuff that Trump is doing.
Yes, it is
We,
dangerous.
when we see the way the Canadians are responding, they're insisting on their sovereignty. And what they're doing is looking for alternative uh, uh, allies, uh, relationships that they can count on because they cannot count on us anymore. And if they do conclude those particular relationships, it's going to be to our detriment. I mean, the cost that we will pay is going to be enormous, including the cost that we're going to have to watch our backs
Mm-hmm.
continuously because there will be no friend there. I mean, the more I think about what's going on with Canada, the more insane I think these foreign policy moves of Trump are.
Mm-hmm.
They are insane. They're unacceptable. We have to overturn them as quickly as we can.
And now we have the boycotts. People, rightly so, they're boycotting the USA, and you can't blame them.
No, I don't blame them. I think they're completely justified in that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at comments. I'll laugh out loud. Putin put it in his head. D, wake up. No, I don't think Putin put it in his head.
No.
He says it's clear Putin is doing to Canada what Putin did with Crimea. It's
Oh
so
my
obvious.
God.
It's not obvious at all, Friar Steve. I mean, Canada is a huge nation with 40 million people. I mean, Crimea is just a little place, and it was always Russian.
Yes.
There is no comparison between the two. I mean, the comparison that you make here, Friar Steve, is idiocy. He wants to annex Canada and Greenland while accepting Putin annexing Crimea and Israel annexing Gaza and West Bank. If you support any of the above, then you support it all, whether you realize it or not. That's also a ridiculous statement, Friar
It
Steve.
is. It is ridiculous.
Canada just puts a banker guy in charge like anyone would ever vote for that. Yeah, I think he's a Goldman Sachs guy, by the way. But I think he's going to win because he's wrapping himself in nationalism. I hear Canada's going to start calling American coffee Mexican coffee, seeing how we don't produce coffee in the United States. Friar Steve says, good article, nice stock indeed. And Friar Steve says, insane indeed. Well, Friar Steve agrees with us about that. Okay, let's get on with the next one. And I guess this is my turn, so I will. This one is from Sonar 21, which is Larry Johnson's blog. And the author of this is Larry C. Johnson, but he's not the only one who blogs here. He gives other people a chance too. But he asks, is the Trump administration using Yemen as an excuse to attack Iran? Well, I don't know if they're doing that quite yet, but they may be. I'm not sure what this is I'm not sure precisely what this is a picture of. I suppose that may be an F-35, but I am not sure. There's no caption on the picture. First, a note about the new author at Sonar21.com. Peter Hensler is a Swiss businessman and attorney who lives in Russia. I met Peter during my recent sojourn in Russia. I hope you take the time to read his 5-part series. Now, forward to World War III. Short answer to the question I present in the title of this piece, yes. Prior to yesterday, the Houthis had not breached the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. The strikes on Houthi sites in Yemen comes after the group said it would restart attacks in the Red Sea if Israel did not honor the terms of the ceasefire and allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. But this is not about bringing the Houthis in submission. This is about Iran, says Larry. Not sure I entirely agree with that, but let's see what Larry has to say. It is no coincidence that the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, issued the following on Friday. Iran, China, and Russia issued a joint statement on March 14th, effectively condemning the U.S., quote, maximum pressure, unquote, strategy vis-a-vis Iran. The statement came from a meeting of the Iranian, Chinese, and Russian deputy foreign ministers in Beijing. The statement called on, quote, relevant parties, unquote, a reference to the United States, to, quote, lift all illegal unilateral sanctions, unquote, on Iran. The statement described Iranian nuclear activities as, quote, exclusively for peaceful purposes, unquote, despite numerous indications that Iran has restarted its nuclear weapons program. Iran currently has enough high-enriched uranium to build 6 nuclear weapons, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. The statement also emphasized the parties' commitment to strengthening their cooperation through BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Tehran wants to use these institutions to undermine U.S. sanctions and build a parallel economic order to the U.S.-led one. The publication of this statement coincides with Russia, China, and Iran concluding their annual joint naval military exercise. This is the seventh iteration since 2019. The ISW conveniently ignores the joint security agreement that Russia and Iran concluded on January 17th, 2025. The Iranian-Russian Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed on January 17, 2025, includes provisions for cooperation in peaceful nuclear energy. Article 23 of the treaty states, quote, the contracting parties shall promote the development of long-term and mutually beneficial relationships or relations for the purpose of implementing joint projects in the area of peaceful use of nuclear energy, including the construction of nuclear energy facilities. The agreement supports ongoing collaboration in Iran's civilian nuclear industry with Russia's state-run, I guess it's Rosatom, currently assisting in the construction of 2 new units at Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant. This cooperation is seen as a significant contribution to Iran's energy security and economic growth. It is important to note the treaty also emphasizes adherence to international non-proliferation agreements. Excuse me. Article 10 mentions cooperation on, quote, non-proliferation within the framework of relevant international treaties, which is interpreted as referring to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. This commitment, along with Russia's historical willingness to support sanctions against Iran for violations of international obligations, provides a critical guarantee against nuclear weapons proliferation, one that the United States should take seriously if it hopes to achieve any progress with Russia on other issues of mutual concern. There are unclaimed firms from Yemen that they fired a combination of missiles and drones at the USS Harry S. Truman, an aircraft carrier. The Trump administration, as of this time, it says nothing about such an attack. I'm certain of one thing: Yemen will fire missiles and drones at U.S. and Israeli ships in the Red Sea, and the U.S. will continue to launch attacks inside Yemen. If the Houthis succeed in hitting a U.S. ship, I think the Trump administration will use this as its casus belli to attack Iran. Instead of cowering in fear, I believe Iran is preparing for the likelihood of a U.S. strike and will retaliate against the U.S. military installations in the region. This could get out of hand real quick if the Saudis allow U.S. aircraft to launch against Iran. Then Saudi oil installations also are likely to be immolated. There are no adults around Trump capable of talking him out of pursuing this insane policy. Trump appears to genuinely believe that he can force both Yemen and Iran into submission with a combination of attacks from combat jets and missiles. He, along with the neocons in the U.S., are likely to learn a very hard lesson if they follow through with their threats. So that's Larry's direct statement of what he believes. He believes war is coming with respect to the United States, and Iran. I sincerely hope he's wrong, but I fear he may be right. Until recently, it looked like Trump was trying to avoid war with Iran, but things have certainly been put into a very ambiguous state with the kind of aggressive attack on Yemen that Trump has been trumpeting for the last few days. I hope you'll forgive me for that particular formulation. Anyway, any comments, D?
No.
Okay. So we're going to take that article at its face value, huh? Okay, no comments from Friar Steve on that as well. So I think we can maybe move on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is D's term. And I will bring this up now. This is an article by Roger Malcolm Mitchell.
Okay.
And he is, he may be described as someone who shares the ideas of monetary sovereignty with the MMTers.
Yes.
For a number of reasons, he is not an MMTer. He doesn't consider himself one. But this is a very good piece on monetary sovereignty. And so I thought it would be a very good thing for us to look at.
Yes.
So please go on, D.
Why federal deficits are necessary. You often read and hear warnings about the federal, quote, debt and deficit. Let me assure you that you do not owe any part of the federal, quote, debt, and your taxes will not be raised to pay the federal, quote, debt. You have seen articles where the so-called, quote, debt amounts to a certain number of dollars per American taxpayer, implying that the federal, quote, debt is your debt. It isn't. You don't owe it, and you will never pay it. In fact, that thing called, quote, federal debt isn't federal, and it isn't debt. The federal, quote, debt is two separate things united by law. It is the total of federal deficits and the total of outstanding Treasury securities, united semantically but not in reality. The federal government pays its bills from the, quote, general fund, known as America's checkbook. Quote, you should understand what money is and isn't. Money isn't paper, gold, silver, or any other physical thing. Money is nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet that by law list money. If, for instance, you keep money in a bank, that bank does not have any physical entity called, quote, money. All of your money is merely numbers on the bank's balance sheets.
Okay, hang on for just a minute, D. I do want to say at this point that when Roger says that uh, when he says to us, "You don't owe it, and you will never pay it,"
Excuse me.
uh, it's not really your debt. This is something I completely agree with, and I've written an article on it also. Okay, it's a daily cost. Okay, and basically it also says, but it uses some numbers. Okay, and tells you that these articles that talk about the debts per taxpayer that Americans owe, or the debt that each of the individual Americans owe. No, right now we don't owe it. Those are obligations of the government. Now, it's possible that politics can be worked over to make you owe that particular debt. it's politics. It's also true that politics can work in such a way that you will be taxed more, supposedly, to pay that particular debt. But that's strictly up to us. It's strictly up to whether we're going to accept that and whether we're going to elect people to office who advocate that and who think, okay, in that way. But as a matter of contractual obligation, we don't owe any of the federal debt. It's just the federal government who owes the federal debt. And the federal debt can always be paid by the federal government and just use tax money to pay that debt. That's very important for you to understand. Anyway, please go on.
Okay, there we are. Many laws, primarily federal, but some state and local, determine these numbers. Ultimately, in America, federal law reigns supreme over how the numbers are handled. The U.S. is monetarily sovereign. It is sovereign over the U.S. dollar. It can do anything it wishes regarding the dollar. It can and does create and destroy dollars at will and give them any value it chooses. There were times when dollars were valued at a certain amount of silver and others were valued as amounts of gold. Today, dollars, quote, float free. They have market value and the government can change this at will. Dollars exist because of federal laws. We do not mine, grow, or build dollars. All dollars are just balance sheet numbers. Congress and the president determine the numbers on the federal government's balance sheets. If, for instance, the Social Security Trust Fund, which isn't a real trust fund, holds about 2.7 trillion. Assume that Congress and the president wanted it to have 5 trillion. Congress simply could vote that the trust fund would now hold 5 trillion, and presto, there would be 5 trillion in the trust fund's books. There would be no need to borrow, tax, or do anything else but pass a law, and the dollars would suddenly exist. So long as Congress doesn't lose the ability to pass laws, the federal government and its agencies can never unintentionally run short of dollars. The federal government creates dollars by passing laws.
Okay, just to comment on that part of it. Okay. He's absolutely right about that. Congress could write a law tomorrow, okay, saying that the trust fund now holds $5 trillion
Mm-hmm.
rather than a 2.7 trillion. One reason why Congress could do that is that there's no money in the trust fund now. It's not a real trust fund. It doesn't exist, okay, at any bank. It just exists as an accounting record.
Mm-hmm.
And if Congress should vote to say, uh, from henceforth, uh, take this accounting record as totaling $5 trillion, then that's what the executive branch and the Social Security Agency would have to do. They would have to value the trust fund at $5 trillion because Congress said so in the form of a law, okay, that it passed. But also, the second reason why this is true is because if Congress suddenly decided to make the trust fund a real trust fund with dollars in it, then according to Article 1, Section 8, Congress could simply create those dollars. Congress has the power, okay, to do that. Okay, Dee, please go on.
Okay, the federal government creates dollars by passing laws, which it can do endlessly. It destroys dollars by accepting payments. To pay your taxes, you or your employer probably withdraw dollars from checking accounts. These dollars are part of the quote M2 money supply measure. The M2 dollars are sent to the IRS or the U.S. Treasury. When they reach the Treasury, they cease to be part of any money supply measure. The Treasury already has the infinite ability to create dollars, and no money supply measure describes an infinite supply. When any amount is added to the infinity, the total still is infinity. So adding any number of tax dollars to the Treasury's supply is not different from adding $0 to the Treasury's supply. Incoming dollars supply cease to exist. Effectively, they are destroyed because federal taxes cease to exist upon receipt. They cannot fund federal spending.
Okay, to make this a little more clear, to be a little more explicit about what happens, when the tax dollars and the bond dollars come into the Treasury, they are deposited in the Treasury General Fund. In the process of doing the deposit, the Federal Reserve destroys the dollars. That's what happens in the process of settlement. It's just the accounting process that comes in. Those incoming dollars simply cease to exist, okay, as he says, as Roger says. Effectively, they are destroyed. So then what happens? Then the Federal Reserve creates an equivalent amount of credits, equivalent amount of reserves. It adds numbers, an equivalent amount of numbers to the Treasury General Account. Those are new money. They don't exist as part of the M2 money supply yet. They will only exist as part of that supply as and when the federal government spends those reserves into existence as money. So I hope that's clear. Please go on, Dee.
The federal government creates all the dollars it spends ad hoc, which means that the payroll tax FICA does not fund Social Security or Medicare. Like all other federal agencies, those agencies are funded by laws created by Congress, meaning monetarily sovereign. The federal government does not borrow dollars. The so-called, quote, federal debt isn't federal. It isn't debt and does not come from borrowing. It is merely a record of dollars flowing in and out. It isn't federal because the dollars are owned by owners of individual treasury securities. It isn't debt for the same reason. The owners never lose ownership of the dollars, and the federal government never touches those dollars. They remain the property of T security holders. The so-called, quote, debt is simply an accounting number, NG number, under congressional control. Congress could easily pay off the debt supply by passing a law adding $35 trillion to the Federal Reserve's books, or it could pass a law adding $70 trillion to the books, thereby giving the Fed a huge surplus. This is what happens when the quote debt increases or decreases.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that part of it, but it's not essential to what we're talking about here. So
Okay.
please continue, Dee.
Because of timing and data definition factors, the Federal Reserve presents federal quote debt in at least three different ways. No method is quote better than the others, and all three demonstrate parallel changes. A recession, vertical gray bars, is usually defined as a reduction in gross domestic product, GDP, employment, and consumer spending. The graph demonstrates that 1. Recessions, the vertical gray bars, occur following a period of reduced debt growth. 2. Recessions are cured during a period of increased debt growth. 3. In most years, there are some debt growth. 2000 was a notable exception, but not enough for sustained economic growth. This makes mathematical sense because GDP equals federal spending plus non-federal spending plus net exports. Increased federal spending adds dollars to the economy, and adding dollars increases non-federal spending. When faced with the algebraic certainty that decreased federal dollar input yields recessions and increased federal dollar input cures recessions, libertarians and other anti-deficit, anti-debt proponents switch to agreeing, but now claim that federal debt growth causes inflation. The reasoning is that adding dollars increases demand, which, with all other things being held equal, would cause prices to rise. The problem with that philosophy is that when the federal government adds dollars to the economy, all other things are not equal. When demand increases, the economy responds quickly by increasing production to meet the demand. Here is the same graph as above, but with the addition of inflation, the purple line. You see, no relationship between changes in federal debt and inflation. The reason is that historically, inflations and hyperinflations have been caused by supply issues, not by demand issues. When the supply of certain products, notably oil and food, is reduced, the economy cannot reduce demand to meet the new lower supply. We can't, we can't quickly eat less, heat and cool our homes less, and or drive less. So prices increase. The most recent severe inflation was COVID related. We had shortages of food, oil, computer chips, metals, transportation, labor, and other needs. The problem was not one of increased demand or caused by federal spending. It was a supply related shortage, which is the norm. Increased federal spending to cure the shortages helped us escape the severe inflation. The bottom line, despite widespread beliefs that federal spending should be reduced and causes inflation, those beliefs are diametrically wrong. Reduced federal spending causes recessions, and federal spending to prevent and cure shortages prevents and cures inflation. Today, the federal government, laboring under false beliefs, is causing havoc by doing precisely the wrong things, cutting staff to reduce spending. While that may be an appropriate approach for a private sector, monetarily non-sovereign entity, it is exactly the wrong path for a monetarily sovereign federal government. Not understanding the difference is a sign of economic ignorance and an approaching recession, if not a depression.
So, this is, of course, even though he doesn't directly reference it in a instance, uh, this is a commentary on what Trump and Musk, okay, are doing now,
Yes,
what the Republican Party, okay, is trying to do now.
right.
To be fair, Trump, uh, since he's so fixated on the tax cuts, is also trying to produce a very large deficit because his deficit will only be partly offset by the cutting of federal spending. So, because of the size of that particular deficit, there will still be a lot of money going into private sector pockets, and that is still going to cause stimulation of the economy. However, uh, it probably won't be as much stimulation as we should have. And secondly, if federal spending is decreased, the kind of federal spending that is relevant for different areas of the economy is decreased, then there's going to be quite a mess in the federal spending department, and those sectors of the economy which are dependent on federal spending are going to have a really tough time. And that's going to reduce consumption, and it's going to reduce sales, and it is going to cause a recession. Okay, and we are going to see that come soon as a result of the savage changes being made in the federal government by Musk, okay, and by Trump, with some aid from the Republican Party in Congress uh, 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 as a whole. So that's what's in store for us, unless we can change the political situation around, or unless Trump changes his mind. When he sees the economy beginning to collapse, he may send Elon home. And we can hope for that. And okay, I think it's a reasonable hope, because Trump doesn't like it when his poll numbers fall through the floor, and he doesn't like it when the economy crashes. And even though he's going to blame it on Joe Biden and say it's Biden's economy, this time nobody's going to believe that. Nobody's going to believe it at all. They know it's going to be due to the disruptions that Trump is putting into the economy right now. And he's going to get that particular blame. So as he sees the results of what he's doing, the federal spending cuts, of course, the tariffs, which are absolutely irrational, okay, in this context, there's a good chance that it'll change. I don't know whether it'll be in a month or two or three or four, but I'm pretty sure by the fall he's going to change his tune, because he is looking at a collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the truth of it. So I will stop sharing this, and we will see if we have any more comments about it. So there's a comment from Friar Steve, who says, I think the drone sightings over U.S. military installations on the East Coast were Iranian and Chinese. I think they were only designed to show the vulnerabilities of using drones to knock out long-range strike aircraft. I don't really have a comment on that. And Friar Steve says, good article. Well, thank you, Friar Steve. So we now come to the next article, which is from the Economic Policy Institute. And it was written by, I believe, Josh Bivens, if I recall correctly. He's sort of the chief economist over there. That's a progressive policy think tank. And this is a relatively short piece. Josh is generally pretty brief. It's written on March 13th, 2025 by Josh Bivens. And it says, the right wing has always had an asymmetric power to destroy. I think what he means by that is that what the right wing tends to do is to break things and to destroy things rather than to build and create new things, even though it insists it is very creative. But then he says, Doge makes it much worse, this asymmetric power to destroy. That's the title. In parliamentary systems, winning an election gives one party, I'm going to increase the zoom on this one, because it is in awfully small print. There it is. In parliamentary systems, winning an election gives one party control of both legislative and executive powers. This means there are big policy swings after elections when parties switch. In the United States presidential system, the separation of powers combined with legislative choke points like the Senate filibuster means that opportunities for very large policy swings are much less common. Even during times when the president is the same party as the majority of both the House and the Senate, a governing trifecta, the weirdness of Senate procedure, specifically the reconciliation budget process that allows one big budget bill per Congress to escape the filibuster, generally means that parties get one chance to effect a major policy change each congressional session. In recent decades, the Republican strategy for this presidential system with choke points has been clear. Using their reconciliation chances to cut taxes for the rich and corporations when they have a trifecta, and using various kinds of legislative blocks, often the Senate filibuster, to stop any tax or social spending increase when there is a Democratic president. The Democratic thrust has been largely the opposite, financing new spending programs like the Affordable Care Act or the Inflation Reduction Act by raising revenue from the rich when they have a trifecta in power and using legislative blocks to stop steep cuts to valuable federal spending programs or taxes on the wealthy when they can. Okay, I think this is generally a description that's correct, except that the raising revenue from the rich when they have a trifecta, okay, in power, of course, the new spending isn't financed by raising the revenue from the rich, as we've just seen from the Roger Mitchell article, and as also would be seen if we went over some of the MMT writings, and as you should have seen in some of my streams from time to time. But other than that, what he's describing is the way things generally go. Anyway, the net outcome of these two directly conflicting strategies has been near stagnation in federal revenue and spending for decades. Yes, and the inability of Congress to cope with changes and the inability of the United States to cope with changing conditions. But this stagnation actually demonstrates a highly asymmetric power to stop needed progress that benefits the right-wing policy agenda. I couldn't agree more with him about that. Throughout history, rich nations have seen an upward drift in the share of national income accounted for by public spending. This regularity is clear, and international data even has a name. The name is Wagner's Law. I don't know which Wagner that is named after, but public spending as a share of GDP, you see going up in all sorts of nations, but you also see the nations are ranked in how much growth there is in public spending, and the United States is way down there. France, Italy, Germany, Japan, Canada, Greece, and Sweden are all above the United States in terms of the growth of public spending. Below the United States is the United Kingdom, Australia, and the Netherlands. So, just wanted to make that clear. These are trends from 1880. See, things move slow between 1880 and 1930, roughly 1930, and then they start to rise in all the relevant countries. Until around now, they're at a peak. Around the current period of time. But this takes it only through 2022, so we don't have numbers here beyond 2022. This rise in public spending is not creeping socialism, but a function of the fact that key needs like retirement and disability insurance Healthcare and education are best provided as public goods. As the country's population ages, it spends more money on mechanisms to ensure income for those who can no longer work. And as nations experience technological advance, healthcare gets more expensive and the population needs more education. Well, I'm not sure that's all that's involved in healthcare getting more expensive, at least in the United States. A lot of healthcare getting more expensive, okay, is due to the fact, simply due to the fact that we will not pass, okay, a Medicare for all bill. We insist on leaving control of healthcare generally in the hands, okay, of private companies, and this has led to very substantial increasing costs over time. Going on, though, none of this necessarily restricts a nation's economic growth. It just means public institutions are needed to ensure that growth leads to prosperity that is broadly shared rather than sharply concentrated. A good point. The presidential system with multiple veto points mean that this need to adapt and increase public sector capacity is throttled, a dynamic that has been labeled, quote, policy drift. This throttling causes economic distress for typical families as it prevents the public sector from being agile. That's a good way to put it. In responding to key challenges in their lives. Yes, the federal government has not been agile in responding to key challenges in our lives, anything but agile.
Mm-hmm.
This in turn feeds a growing cynicism about the capabilities of government. As state capacity erodes, public welfare suffers, and people become more cynical. Further, as people see rich people paying too low taxes due to constant Republican efforts and public services continuing to lag, their faith in effective government erodes. All of this is to the political benefit of a party committed to keeping taxes low for the rich and devaluing the worth, okay, of the public sector. Okay, this is all true, but it neglects the idea that even while providing tax cuts for the rich, if the federal government wished to, if the people, okay, in the Democratic Party did not believe that taxes fund spending, but they believed instead that one could do as much deficit spending as one wanted, as long as one controlled the possibility of inflation, then what people in Congress would do is they would pass additions to the safety net. They would pass changes. They would make sure the public in general was provided for. And they could do that in spite of providing tax cuts to the rich. Probably not forever. And there are other reasons why you would not want to provide the tax cuts to the rich. Why would you want to raise taxes on the rich? But they don't have to do with raising revenue or running out of money or solvency concerns or anything like that. They have to do with the rich having so much money that they control politics. And what we have to do is stop that. That is the imperative thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
not actually cutting. Uh, okay, it's what we should not do is play the game of thinking that the tax revenues are essential to public spending. What we should do is trade, if we would, support for tax cuts for the rich for Republican support of social spending. If we could do that, we would in the end be much better off, and we would be in a much better position also to eventually stop the tax cuts to the rich as well, because other people would, besides the rich, have some money to spend on political campaigns. Going on with the article, though. Given the current Republican trifecta, one might have assumed that they would use the budget reconciliation process to pass one big set of changes, but then the filibuster limited back and forth on the size of the public sector would have continued for the next 2 years. Focusing just on Congress, the expected playbook of tax cuts, mostly for the rich, paired with deep spending cuts for vulnerable families, is moving forward quickly through reconciliation. Even this business as usual scenario would do grave damage to the most vulnerable Americans. However, and here come the punchlines of the article.
Okay.
However, the illegal actions of Doge having added a far more dangerous angle to this asymmetric ability of the right wing to halt needed progress. It used to be that the right wing could just hold the line against Wagner's law and do damage by stopping needed adjustments to the public sector. Gouging too much deeper than that was largely constrained by the legislative blocks that exist in the U.S. political system. Now, however, if they're allowed to use extra constitutional means to affirmatively destroy existing state capacity, that is, to undertake spending cuts that have not been legislated by Congress, the asymmetry between the parties' functional power and the presidential system will explode. Besides end running the filibuster when Republicans have a trifecta, it would also mean that anytime there's a Republican president, they can continue destroying state capacity, even if the Democrats hold Congress. What could possibly be a Democratic response to this new, illegally driven asymmetry that would not also be wildly authoritarian or dangerous, and yet would keep resources to the public sector from imploding? When they have the presidency, should they take full control of the Federal Reserve into the presidency and demand the Fed create money to finance new programs if congressional procedures block the revenue from being raised? Should they create an armed paramilitary tax collection police that storms the houses of the wealthy and corporate owners to demand arbitrary tax payments or their private passwords to financial accounts? Of course, they should not do anything this dangerous. But absent something this reckless, why not do so? Anyway, but absent something this reckless, they will completely lose the ability to construct and maintain a functioning public sector in the face of the anti-constitutional efforts of Doge. There are many
Mm-hmm.
reasons to think that a parliamentary system would be better than our current system of separated powers and legislative choke points. Elections should matter more for policy content than they have in recent decades in the United States. But the worst of all worlds is a system, quote unquote, where only illegal cuts to public capacity are allowed to bypass legislative choke points, while public capacity expansions remain blocked. We would see a perpetual downward ratcheting in the ability of public action to address key problems. This worst of all scenarios is the one we'll be in if Doge's decisions are allowed to stand. Very correct and very well put, that final paragraph. That is what we're watching right now, and hopefully these changes will not stand. But what we're seeing right now, of course, is that the courts are beginning to resist the changes, but things are coming to a head, and to some degree, they are up to Trump.
Mm-hmm.
If he decides to defy the courts, then it's going to be up to certain changes. For example, it will help if the House changes hands and falls to the Democrats. This could happen very shortly under certain scenarios, or it may not happen. It may happen over the next 2 or 3 months because the Republican majority in the House is so slim. Okay, the Democrats, though, recently lost 2 people to death. And okay, so that has meant that the chances of change are less now, but there will be special elections in those areas too. And so we may be looking, instead of looking at 2 or 3 months, we might be looking at 4 or 5 months. But at that point, some of the momentum of Trump will be blocked by a Democratic House. Okay, as for the rest, we have to look to public opinion polls. Okay, we have to look to demonstrations. Okay, we have to look to other perhaps boycotts. We have to look to other ways of fighting the illegal actions, okay, of the administration. We have to look to threats of impeachment. Now, if the Democrats do take over the House, there is the possibility of impeachment, but the Senate, of course, would block any convictions in the present system. But perhaps opinions about Trump and Musk would totally change if their actions do result in a recession, okay, or even in a depression. Then a lot of the Republicans may change their attitudes towards Trump, okay, and Musk if their economic policies are so totally discredited by such events. They won't be able to put this off, okay, on Donald Trump. Then people will be champing at the bit to change the Congress, and there are enough seats at risk for the Republicans in 2026 that the Democrats could be returned to a majority in both the House and the Senate. And if they did have a heavy majority in the Senate, that would make impeachment and conviction for Trump far more likely. So, anyway, that's my commentary on that. Any comments from you, Dee, on it?
I thought it was a insightful article, and we just have to stay on this.
Yep, we are going to stay on it for sure. Okay, let's go to the next piece then, and it is your turn. It is.
You want to see if there's any comments or?
No, there were no comments on it.
Okay.
The comments seem to have stopped. So, though the attendance is pretty good.
Oh, that's good.
And continues to be pretty good. The next article is from Common Dreams, and it's about court actions by students.
Okay.
Okay, so here it is, Common Dreams.
Yes, Free Palestine.
There's the Free Palestine.
Yep, Cornell University students, including Mamadou Tail, right, march in opposition to Israel's annihilation of Gaza in December 2023, Ithaca, New York.
All right, that's some time ago.
Yes, Cornell students, Professor sue Trump for targeting Palestine defenders. Quote, the First Amendment does not come with a, quote, Palestine exception, said the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, which filed the suit. And this is by Brett Wilkins.
Yeah.
A lawsuit filed Saturday on behalf of 2 Cornell University graduates, students, and 1 professor at the Ivy League school in upstate New York is challenging what plaintiffs are calling, quote, the Trump administration's unconstitutional campaign against free speech, particularly as it targets international students and scholars who protest or express support for Palestinian rights. The lawsuit seeks a nationwide injunction of executive orders used by the administration to target and deport international students advocating for Palestinian freedom, rights, and liberation under the guise of protecting national security, explained the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC, which sued on behalf of PhD students Mamadou Tail and Sarim Parasurma and Professor Mukoma Wanugi. Here, the U.S. government is escalating its crackdown on free speech, targeting international students and scholars who speak out for Palestinian rights. ADC, alongside co-counsel, has filed a historic federal lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's unconstitutional executive
Well,
order.
yeah, it's probably executive order, right?
Yeah. And it says here, this is one of those times people will look back on and ask what we did. We will not stand idly by while the government disappears its political opponents. My family fled Europe, European anti-Semitism, and came to the United States where our Constitution protects us from tyranny. My Jewish identity won't be used as an excuse to persecute the Palestinian people and its allies without a fight. And this was by Chris Godchild Bennett, ADC's legal director and co-counsel. ADC National, truly Arab, fully American. And this was on March 17th, 2024.
Okay.
Tal, a British Gambian national, is facing possible deportation for his pro-Palestine activism on campus. Parasurma was arrested last October for protesting Israel's annihilation of Gaza at a career fair and was subsequently de-enrolled from Cornell and banned from the university's campus in Ithaca, New York, for 3 years. Wa Nuji is a professor of literature who works with Tayal. Parasuma and Wa Nuji are U.S. citizens. Quote, defendants attempt to bar non-citizens from criticizing the U.S. government, its institutions, American culture, or the government of Israel, and to prohibit citizens from hearing those views serves no legitimate government interest in preventing terrorism or enforcing immigration laws, the lawsuit states. Quote, the justifications offered are pretextual and dangerous. Criticism of the U.S. government does not constitute terrorism, and criticism of the Israeli government is not anti-Semitism. Tile said in a statement that, quote, the U.S. government claims to be zealous about free speech, except when it comes to Palestine. Quote, we've been here before, McCarthyism to civil rights, to Vietnam, times when the country has deviated from its stated commitments to free speech, he continued. Quote, this is another generational moment, another hour of reckoning. Why is there a Palestine exception? And this is by Momodu. Says, I'm suing Trump. This is my statement. And there's a picture of the filing of the lawsuit and his statement.
Now let's see if we can get a better look at that. Well, it's still in very small.
Yeah, well, we don't have to go over it, I guess.
Yeah, we
It
don't
just
have,
has where it was filed and everything, Northern District of New York.
right. So,
Quote, only in a dictatorship can the leader jail and banish political opponents for criticizing his administration, Tayal added. Quote, a nationwide injunction is therefore necessary while the court considers the merits.
yes, I couldn't agree more.
Yes, Parasurma said, quote, these draconian executive orders aim to crack down on those willing to protest against our country's active role in the genocide of the Palestinian people. They are part of a broader moral crisis on our nation. They are part of a broader moral crisis our nation is grappling with. This lawsuit allows us to recover our basic rights and protect international students like Mamadou Tayal. Wa Ngugu said that, quote, I was born in the U.S., but grew up under the Daniel Arap Moi dictatorship in Kenya in the 1980s. Students and people of conscience in Kenya were being detained, tortured, exiled, or killed. My own family experienced the full brunt of this oppressive society. When I moved back to the US in the early 1990s, I could not foresee this attempt to chill free speech and directly attack our universities. And here, Makuma wa Nugi. I have joined at Modutal and Serem Parasurma, students of conscience at Cornell, in suing Donald Trump for stifling free speech. As a professor, my conscience cannot allow me to see my students being punished and silenced for calling out the genocide in Gaza, suppression of speech. The Trump administration has invoked the president's January executive order authorizing the arrest, detention, and deportation of non-citizen students and others who took part in protests against Israel's assault on Gaza, which has left more than 170,000 Palestinians dead, maimed, or missing, and around 2 million others forcibly displaced, starved, or sickened, according to local international agencies. Israel's conduct in the war is the subject of an International Court of Justice genocide case brought by South Africa. Last week, immigration authorities arrested Mahmoud Khalil, an Algerian citizen of Palestinian descent, who helped Gaza protest at Columbia University while he was a graduate student there. Trump called Khalil's detention the first arrest of many to come. More pro-Israel activist played a role in Khalil's arrest. Shai Davidi, an assistant professor at Columbia, who was temporarily banned from campus last year after harassing university employees, and Columbia student David Lederer have waged what Khalil called a vicious, coordinated, and dehumanizing doxing campaign against him and other activists. The group Canary Mission last week released a video naming 5 other international students it says are, quote, linked to campus extremism at Columbia. The Department of Justice announced Friday that it is investigating whether pro-Palestinian demonstrators at over 60 colleges and universities, including Columbia and Cornell, violated federal anti-terrorism laws. On Monday, ADC Legal Director and case co-counsel Chris Godshall Bennett said that, quote, this is one of those times people will look back on and ask what we did. Quote, we will not stand idly by while the government disappears as political opponents, he continued. Quote, my family fled European anti-Semitism and came to the United States where our Constitution protects us from tyranny. My Jewish identity won't be used as an excuse to persecute the Palestinian people and its allies without a fight. Through this litigation, we seek both immediate and long-term relief to protect non-citizens from deportation and citizens from prosecution based on their constitutionally protected speech, Godshall Bennett added. Lead plaintiffs' counsel Eric Lee said that, quote, this lawsuit aims to vindicate the rights of all non-citizens and citizens in the U.S., but the courthouse is only one arena in this fight. Quote, we appeal to the population. Stand up and exercise your First Amendment rights by actively and vigorously opposing the danger of dictatorship, Lee added. As we prepare to mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution next year, recall the words from the Declaration of Independence that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Pro-Palestine demonstrations continue at Cornell and on campuses across the nation and around the world. Last week, 17 activists, led by the group Students for Justice in Palestine, were detained by police after interrupting a Cornell panel on the history of the so-called Israel-Palestine, quote, conflict, whose members include former Israeli Foreign Minister and alleged war criminal Zipi Livni.
Yes. Okay, Tzipi Livni is also the former foreign minister, okay, of
Oh,
Israel.
okay.
And she's been very prominent as a politician there for many decades now. Okay. So she was at Cornell, and she probably attracted, because she's so prominent, this particular demonstration by the 17 activists.
Right.
So they were detained by police. I am sorry to see that, but that's the way it is. We have to stand up against it. Free speech has to continue to be very important.
It is very important, and we can't be doing this to students. It's terrible.
Yes, and you can't be doing this to American citizens. You can't be doing it to permanent residents here, and you shouldn't be doing it, okay, to anybody here. Free speech is essential for democracy, and we need to defend it with our lives if necessary.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so there we are. I thought it was very important to bring that news to you,
Yes.
and so that's why we've done it. Let's check your comments on it right now. Uh, our attendance has grown here. We're up to 43 people, but our comments ceased at about 10 p.m. It's now about 11:05. Okay, so we will move along to the last of our articles for tonight. This is a repeat. I did this
Okay.
a few streams ago. It is my own piece from 2011, from September of 2011,
Okay.
13 and a half years ago, called Ponzi Schemes and the Ponzi Schemers. And the reason why I wanted to read it again was because Elon Musk continues day after day to say falsely that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It is not a Ponzi scheme. Elon Musk may be involved in Ponzi schemes, but Social Security is not a Ponzi scheme, and this article explains why. And it's at Daily Costs. It's called The Ponzi Schemes and the Ponzi Schemers, and I wrote it under my nom de plume of Let's Get It Done for the Money and Public Purpose blog at Daily Costs that I used to be the administrator of. Anyway, this is September 16, 2011 at 11:32 and 36 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So beginning, Rick Perry, he used to be the governor of Texas. Loose talk about Social Security being a Ponzi scheme is generating a lot of contrary ink or electronic bits of information, as the case may be. Carlin Roche has provided an excellent analysis accompanied by a great discussion, which begins this way. Quote, first of all, let's get a definition of a Ponzi scheme right. According to the SEC, a Ponzi scheme is, quote, an investment fraud that involves the payment of purported returns to existing investors from funds contributed by new investors, unquote. Quite simply, a Ponzi scheme involves the promise of future payments that current returns do not justify, unquote. So a Ponzi scheme is an investment opportunity whose promoters mislead prospective investors or marks, whose investment organization makes payments to existing investors from funds paid into the investment pool by new investors whose promoters promise future payments that current returns on investment do not justify. So, going on with the article. However, Social Security is neither an investment opportunity nor an investment. Quote, investments, unquote, are private sector voluntary business transactions involving risk to the investor and offering the possibility of returns on one's investment, while Social Security is a public sector program requiring payments from members of a specified performance of their income. In return, they become participants in the program and are promised a particular level of benefits correlated loosely to the amount of their payments when they retire at a specified age of eligibility. The level of benefits they are due is cost of living adjusted throughout the period of their participation in the program. There is no economic risk involved in any of this, though there is political risk, since politicians may welsh on their promises and commitments to participants. In addition, Social Security is different from a Ponzi scheme in that its promoters don't intentionally mislead participants in the program. The details about Social Security are very transparent and are recorded in great detail on its website. Lies about the program and fraudulent claims about its benefits are wholly absent from its website. Next, Social Security payments are not made to recipients from new funds paid into the program. There is no such operational connection between payments and FICA collections. Payments go to retirees from the Treasury General Account. FICA collections also end up in that account, but are in no way connected to Social Security payments. The Treasury issues bonds to the Social Security Administration in the amount of its FICA collections, and these bonds can be redeemed by the Social Security Administration when they're needed. Okay, the bonds are actually just an accounting record. Okay, and there's an interest payment which is made on the principal value of these bonds, and which is automatic, and the amount of interest is predetermined by Congress. There's nothing to do with business. There's nothing to do with economics. It's politically determined by Congress. Social Security Trust Fund is an accounting record of these bonds, okay, and the interests, it's not interest actually paid on these bonds, okay, it is interest whose value is added to the principal as part of the accounting record. There are no payments involved from the Treasury Department or from anywhere else. Okay. I hope all that is clear. I hope it's especially clear that the FICA tax collections result in new additions to the Treasury General Account. Okay, they don't have anything physically to do with the Social Security Trust Fund. What they have to do with the Social Security Trust Fund is that their value enters the accounting record, but the money goes to the money triggered by those by the deposit of those collections is new money and goes into the Treasury General Account. Lastly, unlike Ponzi schemes, Social Security promoters, quote unquote, do not, quote, promise future payments that current returns on investments do not justify, unquote. This is true, first, because there are, quote, no returns on investment, unquote, for Social Security, since it's not an investment in the first place. But second, even if one chooses to erroneously consider current Social Security benefit payments as, quote, returns on investment, unquote, it's very clear that the history of Social Security benefit payments since the inception of the program under FBR does fully, quote, justify expectations that future payments will occur as projected by the Social Security Administration and the federal government. Since the program's inception, every participant has received the benefits due to them in consequence of their participation in the program. The history of this performance is now more than 70 years. Of course, now it's 13 and a half years after I've written this. So this is now true that up to the present time, where we're beginning to see some breaks in this pattern, we've now had 83 years of performance. But since Doge has been active, there have been some individuals who, due to error, have failed to receive their payments. There's an article about this, which I could have put into the program tonight, but I figured we won't have time for it. This is not the pattern of a Ponzi scheme, but one of a government entitlement program whose benefits are guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the monopoly currency issuer in the United States. Of course, the monopoly currency issuer is the United States government. Some will look at what I've said, brush aside the logic and the very important contextual frame. We will remark, as a commenter did in reply to Warren Mosler's fine analysis of why Social Security is not, quote, in Ponzi, unquote. The commenter said, quote, you are splitting hairs. What will happen when the money being paid into the SS system is depleted by the money being paid out to people who have previously paid in but now are recipients? The exact same thing happened to participants of a Madoff-style Ponzi scheme. The system will tank. That's close enough. Comments like this assume that Social Security is a fund that can be depleted, that the government requires U.S. dollars in, quote, the fund, unquote, to make its payments, that the fund can only be augmented by FICA receipts. This assumption is wrong, but it leads to claims that Social Security must be, quote, reformed, unquote, by raising the salary cap for FICA payments or by raising the full benefits retirement age, lest Social Security is rendered unable to meet its obligations. This is a false problem, however, because it ignores the capability of the U.S. currency issuer, the government, to create the currency necessary to pay its obligations at will. Professor Stephanie Kelton has put the real issue very well. And by the way, this was back in 2011, of course. Quote, funding Social Security is always and everywhere a political choice. The strongest evidence of this comes directly from the 2009 annual report of the trustees. In that report, they predict gloom and doom for Social Security because, quote, there is no provision in current law that would enable full benefit of payments once the trust funds are exhausted. In contrast, the supplementary medical insurance trust funds are, quote, both projected to remain adequately financed into the eventual future because current law automatically provides financing each year to meet next year's expected costs. It's that simple. The former is in, quote, trouble, unquote, because the government isn't committed to making the payments, and the latter gets a clean bill of health because the government will always make the payments, unquote. I think this really underlines how arbitrary the projections of financial doom from the Peterson crowd, the CBO, other government agencies, and people like Rick Barry, Paul Ryan, and Mitt Romney are. And we might add, okay, for the present time, people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the Peterson Foundation still are. Apart from the silly and unreliable SS projections as far out as 25 to 65 years from now, which of course are now something like 11 to 50 years from now, the predictions of doom are really based on provisions of law that Congress can change at any time in an afternoon, which means that just like the fake national debt crisis, the fake Social Security solvency crisis is Congress's fault. But this brings us even to a more, well, before I get into the more central issue, let's recall the article from Roger Malcolm Mitchell, who pointed out that Congress could change the value of the Social Security Trust Fund just very easily by directing the Social Security Administration to change its value from roughly 2.65 billion, where it is 5 trillion, to where it is now, to 5 trillion. It could do that, could put 50 trillion in there as the limit. The key point here is that what's in that fund is not money. It's just a limit of Social Security spending. What the money comes from is the appropriations of Congress that mandate certain payments on Social Security coming from the Treasury General Fund each year. The only necessary connection between the accounting trust fund, and those payments is the formula that when the accounting record of the trust fund falls to zero, that full payments cannot be made. But of course, as Roger Mitchell said, that could easily be avoided just by Congress changing the value of the accounting record on the trust fund to 5 billion, which Congress has the power to do, at any time. Our problem is making Congress do things like that, or making Congress, for example, simply cancel the connection to full payments based on what's in the trust fund, and just say, let the trust fund fall to zero. These payments of Social Security benefits are always a matter of the appropriations of Congress. If Congress appropriates the spending, it will happen. If it doesn't appropriate the spending, it won't happen. That's the reality behind all of this. So that's what we should be taking into account. Assuming for the sake of argument that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, this gets to the more central issue I was going to talk about. Assuming for the sake of argument Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, then who are the, quote, Ponzi schemers, unquote? The managers who want to structure things so that the promised returns are eventually not paid to, quote, the marks, unquote, the retirees in the program, and who also want to use the bonds issued to the program to enrich private sector managers rather than the retirees. I think the answer to this last question is plain. The very people who are questioning the sustainability of Social Security and other entitlements, and in particular, Rick Perry, Mitt Romney, and the deficit hawks, and we might add Elon Musk and Donald Trump, who are making claims of coming insolvency, are the people proposing, quote, reforms, unquote, as the Peter G. Peterson Foundation is always proposing reforms, and those reforms involve usually increasing taxes or reducing Social Security or reducing the value of the Social Security Trust Fund, or stretching the age of people out so the trust fund will take longer to fall to zero. So the people proposing reforms that will break Social Security's promises to retirees and future retirees, while failing to ensure that Social Security can always make its payments and can never be, quote, in Ponzi, unquote. They are the, quote, managers, unquote, who are scheming to put Social Security, quote, in Ponzi, unquote, so that they can enrich their campaign contributors and the financial elites that deliver the financial outcomes to those elites that they think they are entitled to. These elites complain that working people and regular Americans aren't entitled to social safety net benefits, and certainly Musk is that way. And they speak scornfully about the right of the rest of us for a decent life free from want and fear. That right, by the way, is the rights that were spoken of to the American people and extended to the American people by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and its rights that we should all continue to grasp. But going on, but it is they whose entitlements to get richer at any cost to the rest of us need to be denied and rejected, They are not entitled to sacrifice the rest of us on the altar of their greed, and we must not allow them to swindle us out of Social Security and other safety net benefits. Let us now join the battle. It is the second, and I should say, Green New Deal or serfdom for us. And by the way, the Silicon Valley billionaires are often spoken of as trying to impose a regime of techno-feudalism on the rest of us. So the image of serfdom is quite relevant here. Let us fight the good fight and put the plutocrats and the Ponzi schemers in their place. Let us take our democracy back, and this time see to it that we never come close to losing it again. Of course, here in 2025, we are much closer to losing it than we were in 2011. So it is now more important for all of us to join the battle. It is the second Green New Deal or serfdom for us. Let us fight for what is ours. Let us take our democracy back. And let us see to it that we never come close to losing it again. Any comments on that?
That was very good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
That's the closing. Your
We're
closing
now,
statement.
yes, that's a good closing statement. And we are now at 41 people, so we're doing decently well. Okay, in attendance in this particular situation. And by the way, we're only at 2 hours and 22 minutes or so,
That's good.
which is a bit of improvement over last time when we were certainly at, I think we were at 3 hours and 10 minutes last time. So
Mm.
we're doing a little more reasonably today. So good night, everyone. Okay, Dee, will you be back tomorrow night?
I believe so. I should be back tomorrow night.
Okay, I will try to join you if I can.
Okay.
I have some things going on tomorrow, so I'm not sure whether I will be able to. But I will be coming back at 8 o'clock on Thursday, and Dee will have a show at 9 o'clock on Thursday, I'm sure.
Yes.
So I will be here for both of those shows. And I would think I will have some very good things to talk about once more.
Well, there's so much going on in this world.
I know there's so much going on in this world, and let's hope that Trump steps back from brinksmanship with respect to the Iranians, because I don't think you can play brinksmanship with them.
Mm.
I think that they will answer aggression with aggression.
I believe so too.
And that in a war with the Iranians, we will lose. And we won't have recourse to nuclear weapons because the Iranians will be backed by the Russians, okay, and the Chinese.
All right. And what the U.S. and Israel is, what they're banking on, they're thinking these are the old days, the old wars in the region. They don't realize the upgraded technology
Yes.
that's there.
Yeah, the upgraded technology inside of Iran
Yes.
and inside of a lot of the rest of the world. This is not the old days any longer. We are not the hegemon, okay, any longer, even though oftentimes we think we are.
Yes.
And it's very important to point that out.
Right. And we're being isolated the same as Israel's being isolated.
Yes, we are if we choose to be isolated. Now, one good thing about the Trump administration is that the openings to Russia, those are moves against isolation. But the policies towards Israel are moves towards further isolation. Because
Yes.
the rest of the world is condemning us for that and is charging us with complicity in genocide. And we have to end that by stopping the genocide,
Yes, we do.
by stopping the Israelis from continuing the genocide.
And it's all about Netanyahu's ego.
Well, it's also about, the right wing Mizrahi Jews and their dreams for a greater Israel.
Yes. Now, normally, Netanyahu, like we're saying right now, it's all his legal issues and all this to stay in power that he gives credence and goes along with anybody that will give him power.
Yes.
So it's really not the safety of Israel and the survival of Israel. It's just about his survival
Yes.
and his ego and who will ever prop him up. That's what I always keep thinking, like, why isn't he overthrown? Why can't they just overthrow him?
I don't think they can overthrow him because he probably has a majority of Israelis behind him right now. Because the Mizrahi Jews, I think, are in. I think they're in the majority right now. I think that's the problem.
Yeah, because you hear the like I said, that there's that the one group is just so extreme, and then you have others that are trying to, they're out there, they're protesting to end what's going on in Gaza, and the left doesn't have the power, and as we've said over the years, a lot of the left had departed from Israel because of the nonsense. So they just don't like the right wing shift. But
They don't.
right now, Israel is hurting, and it really needs a shift to the left. But it's in a dangerous place.
If the Israelis made a shift to the left and they made a settlement with the Palestinians, I think the in-migration would probably start again
Oh, definitely.
and they would grow. But instead, I think they're doing the opposite and they're losing a lot of people of goodwill who have chosen to move out.
Hmm.
Partly because the neighborhood they're in is now very dangerous and they cannot guarantee security, but also because there are lots of people, good people, who want no part of the genocide and don't want to be part of it.
No.
So that's it.
Hmm.
So, on that note, let us say good night.
Yes. Good night, Joe.
And
And
good night.
good night. Good night, Bonnie.
Good night. And good night, everyone. And thank you very much for coming tonight. And
Yes.
we're
Thank
going
you for
to
having me, and peace out. Right.
peace out. Uh, yes, peace out. And free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Amen.
And good night, everyone.